Oh, Merry Christmas. If people weren't thinking about kettles before, they can now. And I know you really enjoyed brushing off your car this morning. For months you've been thinking about how nice that would be to do that, and today you had your chance. That's great. And my apologies to everybody who we made feel like you came in late. You weren't late. That wasn't anybody's evil scheme. That was just when I have my glasses off to play the band music, I can't see that clock at the back. we started early, so you weren't late. Sorry about that. I promise it'll never happen very many more times. If we get up to start the meeting early, just go, hey, no, not yet. Okay, we're looking at Hosea chapter 2. If you have Bibles, Hosea chapter 2, where it says, "Say of your brothers, my people, and of your sisters, my loved one." And if you were here last week, you might remember that chapter 2, verse 1 concludes the argument of chapter 1, and now at chapter 2, verse 2, we're going to move on to some new information about what's going on here. But you have to realize that chapter 2 is a poem. It's written in the form of Hebrew poetry, so it's not as straightforward a narration of the story as we had in chapter 1, and we will have in chapter 3. But I think the gist of the argument will be evident enough. To understand this, you have to remember that Hosea's marriage and Hosea's family that we talked about last week are meant to be a picture of God in relationship with us, His people, who are sometimes unfaithful. So the story of Hosea continues to be told here, and the story of the unfaithfulness of ancient Israel is being told here. But our story is being told here as well. There's 3 layers of truth, and we're blessed with a congregation intelligent enough to be able to read and understand this on all 3 layers. Hosea is lamenting the unfaithfulness of his wife Gomer, who he loves. And God is lamenting the unfaithfulness of Israel, who he loves. And we, at the same time, are being challenged to think about the state of our own spiritual lives through the details of this story. So we need to read it. Here we go. "Rebuke your mother, rebuke her, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. Let her remove the adulterous look from her face, and the unfaithfulness from between her breasts. Otherwise I will strip her naked and make her as bare as on the day she was born. I'll make her like a desert, turn her into a parched land, and slay her with thirst. I will not show my love to her children, because they are the children of adultery. Their mother has been unfaithful and has conceived them in disgrace. She said, I will go after my lovers who give me my food and my water, my wool and my linen, my olive oil and my drink. Therefore, I will block her path with thorn bushes. I will wall her in so that she cannot find her way. She will chase after her lovers, but not catch them. She will look for them, but not find them. Then she will say, I will go back to my husband as at first, for then I was better off than now. She has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine and oil, who lavished on her the silver and gold which they used for Baal. Therefore I will take away my grain when it ripens and my new wine when it is ready. I will take back my wool and my linen intended to cover her naked body. So now I will expose her lewdness before the eyes of her lovers. No one will take her out of my hands. I will stop all her celebrations, her yearly festivals, her new moons, her Sabbath days, all her appointed festivals. I will ruin her vines and her fig trees, which she said were pay from her lovers. I will make them a thicket, and wild animals will devour them. I will punish her for the days she burned incense to the Baals. She decked herself with rings and jewelry and went after her lovers. But me she forgot, declares the Lord. Therefore, I am now going to allure her. I will lead her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. There I will give her back her vineyards, and will make the valley of Achor a door of hope. There she will respond as in the days of her youth, as in the day she came up out of Egypt. In that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband. You will no longer call me my master. I will remove the names of the Baals from her lips. No longer will their names be invoked. In that day I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field, the birds in the sky, and the creatures that move along the ground. Bow and sword and battle I will abolish from the land, so that all may lie down in safety. I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in righteousness and justice, in love and compassion. I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will acknowledge the Lord. In that day I will respond, declares the Lord. I will respond to the skies, and they will respond to the earth, and the earth will respond to the grain and the new wine and the olive oil, and they will respond to Jezreel. I will plant her for myself in the land. I will show my love to the one I called not my loved one. I will say to those called not my people, you are my people. And they will say, you are my God. Amen. The word of the Lord. And remember, Hosea has a little girl called Not Loved, and a little boy called Not Mine. And Hosea is their father, just as God is the father of Israel, who has refused to live as the people of God, and who has refused to live in covenant faithfulness in such a way as to tap into the love of God. But we have a God who promises here in those last verses of Hosea chapter 2 that the possibility of being loved by God still exists, and the possibility of becoming the people of God still exists. Through the prophet Hosea, God is, of course, telling the story of the cross, the story of redemption. Our November theme is You Can't Stop God from Loving You. And the title of this sermon today is You Can't Stop God from Loving You. So it should be obvious to you that I think this is something worth talking about. It's important for people to realize that there's nothing you can do to make God stop loving you. Nothing. And as a way of helping you to come to that conclusion, I'm showing you this story, the story of Hosea. Last week we looked at chapter 1, where the prophet Hosea married a prostitute named Gomer. Now, prostitution was not meant to exist in Israel. It was not meant to be tolerated in Israel. Israel was the chosen people, a nation with God as their king. And God had built into the laws of this nation a zero-tolerance policy for prostitution. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 17, no Israelite man or woman is to become a prostitute. End of story. God's will in the matter is crystal clear. But as this nation, Israel in the north, becomes more and more successful and more prosperous, they became more and more tolerant of other religions. So now in the 8th century BC, during the lifetime of the prophet Hosea, they've allowed the followers of Baal and Asherah to build their shrines in Israel. And worship in those shrines was like it is in some modern day cults. There was a sexual component to the worship. And in order to accommodate all the worshipers, there were the shrine prostitutes in a land where there shouldn't have been any. And Gomer found herself trapped in that lifestyle. She shouldn't have been a prostitute according to the law of Israel. In an ideal world, she wouldn't have been. We don't know a whole lot about her, where she came from, what her family was like, or what resources had been available to her in life. All we know is that she was desperate enough to find some sort of survival level income by being a prostitute, selling her body for money. She didn't enjoy it. Being a prostitute is a horrible way to earn a living. Can't even really call it a living. It's a living nightmare, maybe, for those girls. We've known several over the years, and especially when we were involved in Core 614 down in Toronto. And I can assure you, those poor girls don't stand out on the street because it's fun. And God sends the prophet Hosea, this holy man, to rescue this girl off the street and marry this poor, broken girl. And as you know, it's not an entirely happy story. We learned last week that poor Gomer found it difficult to remain faithful to Hosea. So she ends up back out in the streets, and she gets pregnant, and she has a daughter named Lo-Ruhamah, not loved, and she continues to be unfaithful, and she gets pregnant again, and she has a son named Lo-Ami, not mine. Very sad state of affairs, for sure. But God is using Hosea's marriage and his family situation to get his point across. He's saying, Israel, we started off in covenant relationship. I was your God and you were my people. But you have chosen to not be my people. You've cut yourselves off from my love through your covenant unfaithfulness. Now, throughout all of this, Hosea is still very much in love with Gomer, as we'll find out next week. And most people find that hard to understand because we're tempted to not like Gomer, this unfaithful, ungrateful girl. But if Hosea loves her, who are we to judge? And Hosea is meant to be a picture of God and how he looks at us. So, if Hosea is not prepared to stand in judgment against Gomer, we can't either. I guess we need to love her as well. Now, last week I told you about a Salvation Army stage musical called Hosea that came out in 1969. There's a song in Hosea that says this: "We all prefer to classify the people that we meet, to stamp and label everyone as bitter or as sweet. But what's the use of trying to give everyone a name? For underneath the surface, they are people, just the same. No matter what we call them in this label game, underneath the surface, folk are much the same. They all need hope and faith, these people passing by. They all need love. They all need God. There are only people. Only people. And our superficial judgments are all wrong. There are only people. Only people." That's good. Only people. And here's a couple of people, Hosea and Gomer, who are meant to help us understand something about ourselves. In fact, as I said, Hosea is meant to be a picture of God. And it's God who tells Hosea to marry a prostitute. So if you're tempted to say, well, this story about a prostitute hasn't got anything to do with me, you would be entirely wrong. Hosea is a picture of God. God tells Hosea to marry a prostitute so that God's people, ancient Israel, and us today can understand what it's like for God to be in covenant relationship with us. In fact, prostitute is God's favorite image for us, his people, throughout the entire Bible. Did you know that? Leviticus chapter 20, "I will set my face against anyone who turns to mediums and spiritists to prostitute themselves." Judges chapter 2, "Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them." 1 Chronicles chapter 5, "But they were unfaithful to the God of their ancestors and prostituted themselves to the gods of the peoples of the land." The Lord uses prostitution as a metaphor for spiritual unfaithfulness. constantly throughout the Bible. Sometime in the new year, we're going to take a look at the prodigal son story, the story of the lost son. It's, again, a story about God in relationship with his people. And in that story, there's a man who's in the family of God, but he quits the scene to go and waste his life on prostitutes. That's what that story's about. That's how God sees the unfaithfulness of our hearts. The most graphic example is probably in Ezekiel chapter 16, which we're also going to take a look at down the road after Christmas sometime. There in that chapter, you have the ridiculous situation of a prostitute who pays the customers. And again, it's the story of God in relationship with unfaithful people who give away the blessing of a relationship with God in exchange for what the world has on offer. We'll take a look at that. But that's how God sees us. We prostitute ourselves to the enticements of the world rather than remaining faithful to our husband, who is the God who loves us. So, what about Hosea and Gomer? When we come to understand that it's about our relationship with God, well, it's a very humbling story. And there are three ways we need to understand Hosea chapter 2. First, we need to pick out the clues that help us to fill in the blanks about what happens to Gomer after chapter 1. In chapter 1, Gomer is unfaithful to Hosea and has 2 children from other men. And here in chapter 2, she gets passed around from one man to another until she ends up in a situation she can't escape from. God says, I will hedge her in with thorn bushes. She's out there and she's being passed around from one to another, and she gets in this situation she cannot escape from. She wants to go home, but she cannot. God has hedged her in with thorn bushes. And we'll get to that next week, how God and Hosea go to the rescue. That's next week. But getting ourselves trapped in sin is nothing new. The Exodus story, those people couldn't rescue themselves. God had to come to their rescue. Ezekiel chapter 16, there's a girl there who cannot rescue herself from the mess she's made. And God comes to the rescue. The prodigal son story, no matter how hard he tries, he cannot extricate himself from the pig slop life he's got himself into. But it says in that chapter, in Luke chapter 15, verse 20, that God, the Father in that story, ran to him. We have a God who delights in coming to the rescue. Is that not so? And here we have Gomer, and if there's going to be any hope for her, apparently it's going to be necessary for God to come to her rescue. And he will, of course. The second way to look at this is to understand how the story of Hosea and Gomer is a picture of God in relationship with his people. You can see aspects of this when the poem in chapter 2 is about Israel, not just about Hosea and Gomer. When it talks about the yearly festivals and the Sabbath days and the people worshiping Baal and so on. The poem in chapter 2 transitions back and forth between details of what's happening in Gomer's life and details of what's happening in the life of Israel. That's the whole point. It's an analogy of what's happening in Israel, the unfaithfulness of the so-called covenant nation. God is not pleased with them. He's not pleased with Israel. And through the life of these people and their family, God is trying to say something to Israel. He's trying to get their attention and let them know that he's not happy with them. The covenant that God made with Old Testament Israel is like a marriage, a covenant. God has, in effect, betrothed Israel to himself, and Israel has not been faithful. Well, so what? You always have to ask that, don't you? What has this got to do with me? Well, that's the third way we need to understand Hosea chapter 2. What's it got to do with us? Well, I think God is saying that we too have been invited into covenant relationship with God, and over again we have proven to be unfaithful. unfaithful in our words, unfaithful in our actions, unfaithful in our attitudes, unfaithful in our lack of response to the need we see all around us, unfaithful in our judgment of others, unfaithful in our reluctance maybe to step into mission and ministry as we should. Let's face it, at times we have disappointed God. Well, the good news, of course, is that God is faithful even when we are not. In verse 19, the Lord promises to betroth us to himself forever in love and compassion. This in spite of our unfaithfulness. A day is coming when, through the blood of Christ and the power of the Spirit, he will, verse 23, show his love to the one called not my loved one, and say to those whose behavior might sometimes indicate that they are not the people of God, you are my people. And by God's grace, we'll be able to answer, and you are my God. Here's a song from the musical Hosea that some of you will know. You can't stop God from loving you, though you may disobey him. You can't stop God from loving you, however you betray him. From love like this, no power on earth the human heart can sever. You can't stop God from loving you. Not God. Not now. Not ever. There's nothing you can do to make God stop loving you. I can worship a God like that. Can you? Let's be still in the presence of a God like that and let him love us. Julie's going to help us and we'll sing, "Be still for the presence of the Lord," the presence of that God who loves us. Let him wrap his arms of love around you and around your life and around your family and your ministry and our core. Please be in prayer as we sing.